Hi folks, welcome back. This is chapter 5, separate and together. This is looking at groups, how groups impact us within the socialization process and our identity and all kinds of things. So, a group is a collection of people who share some attribute, identify with one another, and interact with each other. Social groups provide the values, norms, and rules that guide people's lives. This proximity is very much important. Just because there's an assemblage of people gathered doesn't mean that they're a group. As I mentioned, there's the difference between a crowd and a group. Unlike a group, a crowd is a temporary gathering of people in a public place. These individuals don't identify with each other and will not remain in contact with each other afterwards. A crowd is one example of an aggregate or a collection of people who share a physical location but don't have lasting social relations. Although the terms group and crowd are often used interchangeably, you can see that they're actually quite different from one another. For example, if you see a bunch of people in the cafeteria waiting in line for lunch, you would likely consider them a crowd and not a group. You would likely see an aggregate at an airport or in line for a ride at the theme park. You may also see an aggregate in front of a car accident or other events because people tend to gawk at unusual sights. So there are distinct differences between groups and aggregates. There are, of course, primary and secondary groups. Primary groups usually involve the most face-to-face interaction and cooperation and the deepest feelings of belongings. These are our close ties. Secondary groups are larger and less personal. They usually are organized around a specific activity or a task. In our primary groups, we tend to express a full range of emotions, and we wouldn't necessarily be comfortable expressing all of those emotions just to anyone. But our primary groups tend to be our intimate groups. In these groups, we are closely associated with our members. Primary groups, families and friends. Secondary groups, we usually don't feel the strong emotional tie in these groups. We share a common interest in a goal, but not much life experience. Social networks. Research on social networks has been shown that indirect ties can be as important as direct ties. So it's not just whom you know that matters, but whom they know as well. Sometimes you're able to make connections through others, which can lead to you friends, employment opportunities, or even love relationships. And a social network is a structure made up of individuals and groups tied together by different types of relationships. Sometimes it's friendship, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's work. You and your family, peers, colleagues, teachers, and coworkers constitute essentially your social network. Separate from groups, anomie or virtual membership. Of course, Emil Durkheim and Robert Putnam have worried that the modern world creates a lack of connection, while others argue that these worries are overstated and that the new technologies like the internet allow us to connect with others in new ways. But the internet is not preventing suicide, folks. It might be speeding it up, which falls in line with Emil Durkheim's studies on disconnectivity and social anomie. And we really need to understand how a disconnection can create some real serious implications for individuals living in the modern 21st century society. Group dynamics are patterns of interaction between groups and individuals. Group dynamics includes how we form and fall apart and how we influence members. It's interesting how adding or subtracting just one person from a group can completely change the group dynamic. How we put our groups together is important. In the absence and addition of people to that group changes the group dynamic, whether you want it to or not. When we think about groups, we really need to think about dyads, triads, and more. A dyad is the smallest possible group, 2 members. It is unstable because of the small size. If one person leaves, the group ceases to exist. And it's hard to make decisions in a dyad. A triad, or a 3-person group, is a more stable group than a dyad. Conflicts between 2 members can be mediated by the third. So the third person allows for conflicts to be resolved. So you can see the effects of group size on relationships. You have 1 relationship in a dyad, 3 relationships in a triad, 6 relationships in a group of 4, and 10 relationships in a group of 5. Another concept that we have to really deal with here is in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is a group that a person identifies with and feels loyalty towards. In-groups can be thought of as us, and out-groups can be thought of as them. The out-group is the group that a person feels opposition, rivalry, or hostility towards. Most of us are associated with a number of in or out groups based on our ethnic, religious, familial, professional, or educational backgrounds. In my mind, in-group, out-group stuff is really what's causing a lot of the problems. I understand as human beings we want to associate. We are not hermits. We are social beings, and we want to form into groups. And when we form into groups, we naturally form in opposition to an other. But in a very polarized society like the one we live in today, this in-group, out-group dynamic is creating a lot of social problems. Reference groups. A reference group is a group that provides a standard of comparison against which people evaluate themselves. A reference group might be our family, might be our friends. However, it could be the mass media. Many people argue that the reason we see so much over-dieting, anorexia, and bulimia in young people is due to the media's portrayal of images of men and women as being perfect, which are basically unattainable, yet often the reference group to their audience, and that reference group is what that audience is striving to be, something unattainable. We also have to think about group cohesion. Group cohesion is the sense of solidarity or loyalty that individuals feel toward a group to which they belong. You can think of group cohesion as the social glue that holds our groups and societies together. A group is more cohesive when the individual members feel strongly tied to the group, but too much cohesion can lead to the kind of poor decision making, something we call groupthink. Groupthink is the tendency of very cohesive groups to enforce a high degree of conformity among members, creating a demand for unanimous agreement. Groupthink sometimes develops in large companies when individuals are pressured to agree with the group, so they stop offering novel ideas, which of course can cause the company to falter because we're no longer being as creative as we once were. Some companies try to combat this think tank mentality where individuals are encouraged to brainstorm and come up with new ideas. A good relevant example is that of the 2018 presidential election. Media engaged in groupthink to the point that various outlets were predicting a win for Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that Donald Trump inevitably won. Social influence, especially peer pressure, is extremely important in our development. Social influence, i.e. peer pressure, is the influence of one's fellow group members on individual attitudes and behaviors. Generally, we conform to group norms because we want to gain acceptance and approval, i.e. positive sanctions, and avoid rejection and disapproval, i.e. negative sanctions. This is actually common in our society. People feel pressure to fit in, and they often follow popular trends or go along with the ideas of friends as a result. This is particularly problematic for adolescents. They feel tremendous pressure to fit in, and sometimes they make bad decisions in an effort to do such a thing. It's very common to hear stories in the news about teens who get into trouble. And most of this comes from peer pressure. There's some types of conformity. Compliance, or the mildest form of conformity, where actions to gain reward or avoid a punishment comes from complying. Identification, essentially conformity to establish and maintain a relationship with a person or a group. And internalization, the strongest type of conformity, where an individual adopts the beliefs or actions of a group and makes them his or her own. Teamwork is also extremely important when we're talking about groups. A group almost always outperforms an individual, but rarely performs as well as it could, in theory. A group's efficiency usually declines as its size increases because organizing takes time and social loafing increases with group size. Social loafing means that as more individuals are added to the group responsible for the task, each successive addition contributes a little less. Furthermore, the more people become involved, the harder it will be to discern individual effort. It's impossible for any single person to receive credit or blame. Motivation usually suffers in this type of relationship. Social identity is extremely important when we talk about teamwork. Group leaders can increase efficiency by recognizing individual effort or by increasing members' social identity. The degree to which they identify with the group is especially important to how much they gain in reference to social identity. Power, authority, and style. Power is the ability to control the actions of others, and it includes coercive power, which is backed by a threat or force, and influential power, which is supported by persuasion. Which power do you think is more effective? Why? Is it coercive power or is it influential power? Max Weber identified 3 types of authority found in social organizations. Traditional authority, which is based on the customs, birthright, or divine right, and is usually associated with monarchies and dynasties. Legal rational authority, which is authority based in rules, laws, and procedures. And charismatic authority, which is authority based in the perception of remarkable personal qualities in a leader.